She told me to close this, but I don't see where.
What's that?
The YouTube. Just a moment.
Oh, I see you now.
All right, should I go? Oh, no.
Just a moment, I think. Just a moment then.
You're live, Susanna.
Thank you, thank you. So welcome back, everyone, to our second Primate Conversations of the Hillary Term Series at Oxford University. I am absolutely thrilled to see the popularity of the seminars we are broadcasting, both in the UK and abroad. We have reached really almost 1,000 followers in our Primate Conversations page and in our YouTube channel, where you can listen talks live or just enjoy the seminar within your own schedule afterwards. It's really getting more and more views by the day. Last week's talk, we started the series with Dr. Cataline Coops on the origins of technology, is now available. And if you could not attend, I do recommend. It has been seen by hundreds of people now. The silver line of the pandemic, and I suppose there has to be at least one or two to keep us going, was indeed to be able to open our events to the world and equally to host very busy speakers that many times find difficult traveling to Oxford to deliver one talk. As usual, during the talk of today, please feel free to write your comments or questions in the live chat. And after the talk, we will do our best to address as many interesting questions as we can. Today, I am particularly delighted, I have to say, and honored to introduce our speaker. He has been in our list of favorites. We had a list called the Dream Speakers in 2017, where we were 6 people in the lab instead of 20. And so he has been in the list to be invited since the start of our series. And finally, today, we have the great pleasure to host Professor Daniel Lieberman. Professor Lieberman academic path initiated in Harvard, where he studied for a BA in anthropology. Then he came to Cambridge, shall I say the other side, to do a master degree in biological anthropology, and then back to Harvard to another master degree and for his PhD. I think he briefly passed by Rutgers University and George Washington University before returning to Harvard, where he is now the Edwin M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences and Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology. He's a paleoanthropologist studying and teaching how and why the human body looks and functions the way it does. He has long been fascinated by the evolution of the human head, but his main focus, as he says, is currently on the evolution of human physical activity. Lieberman is best known for his work on the evolution of bipedalism and human locomotion, and for his part in developing and testing the endurance running hypothesis. Equally famous is his research into the biomechanics of barefoot running, an activity that he also undertakes, I discovered when doing some research, in the summer, being quite a marathon runner, which has earned him the nickname of the Barefoot Professor. Is that true? He has been the recipient of a long list of awards, and he has been a truly inspirational scientist and mentor for many paleoanthropologists and others. I think Professor Lieberman also believes there are actually practical benefits from his research. And in an interview I read to the New York Times, where he was asked if his research is part of a trend, he answered, it's part of this movement to try to listen to the evolution of our bodies. Dan Lieberman has a very extensive list of milestone publications. It's not the idea here to go and do a list, a CV list. But by the way, many of the articles are part of our reading list. So if you are a human sciences student attending this talk, pay attention, especially to the talk of today. He has published 3 books, 2011, The Evolution of the Human Head, 2013, The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health and Disease. And this year, just out during the pandemic times, he published Exercise, Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. And if you have not yet acquired this book, I do recommend you to do so. It's another silver lining of the pandemic that reading books is going up and book selling is going up after many years. So that's great. And also the topic of the book could not be timelier. It's actually the precise topic of today's talk. So without further ado, I would really like to welcome Professor Lieberman. And thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoy your virtual time with us at Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. What an introduction. I can't possibly live up to it. And I really wish I could be with you in person, but next time. But anyway, it's nice to see everybody. And let me share my screen in traditional Zoom fashion. Here we go. Hopefully this is working. And today I'd like to really, I'm not a primatologist, and so I'm a little bit of a fish out of water, or maybe an ape out of the forest here in this talk. But I thought I'd try to put some thoughts about human physical activity, the evolution of human physical activity in its kind of ape context. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. That's my attempt to fit into the primate conversations theme here. But and what I'm going to talk about today is really what I'm calling the active grandparent hypothesis. And it's if you're interested, it's basically chapter 10 of this book that I'm working on. And before I go any further, I want to thank a lot of folks, too many to mention here. But I particularly want to thank these 2 fellows here. This is Rob Shave and Aaron Baggish, my 2 colleagues, because I'm going to end the talk with some of the collaborative work that we did on hypertension. That's going to be kind of the data part of this talk. So, as Susanna mentioned, I study how and why the human body is the way it is, and I combine comparative anatomy and paleontology, and we do experiments in the lab, sticking, EMG electrodes in people and measuring oxygen and various other, and doing inverse dynamics on treadmill. Here you can see we took somebody's head off on a treadmill in my lab. And then we also, because you can't just understand human beings by studying people in Cambridge, either Cambridge, UK, or the United States, I also do field work, and I have a long-standing field site in Kenya. We're working for 12 years in the same community, but I've also recently added a second field site in Mexico, in northern Mexico. And my major interest, although I started off as a head guy, my major interest really has become the evolution of human physical activity. And I'm really especially interested in walking and running, but we've also been working on throwing and sweating and carrying and sitting and various other kinds of things. Because you want to study physical activity, you also have to study physical inactivity. And so what I want to sort of begin with is what I call the exercise paradox, which is that everybody, you don't need to have a PhD or a MD degree to know that physical exercise is good for you, and physical activity is good for you. And yet the vast majority of Americans, and I've also looked at the data in the UK, though the data in the UK is not collected in exactly the same way, but the World Health Organization, every major health organization in the world recommends that adults get 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. And in the United States, less than 20% of Americans get that. And actually about half of Americans never exercise in their leisure time. And the data in the UK aren't really much different. So the question I want to ask is, why is exercise so healthy for us? And in particular, I want to talk about the aging aspects of exercise, because everybody knows that exercise is good, but the evidence is that as you get older, exercise becomes more and more beneficial. So this is a very famous study. It's actually one of the first major epidemiological studies on the effects of exercise. It was done by a fellow named Ralph Paffenbarger, who was a professor at Harvard Medical School. And he figured out that that universities are actually a great place to study aging, because universities keep track of their alums, right? And they're constantly asking them for money, especially in the US, right? So he convinced the Harvard Alumni Association to let him collect data on alums, and then basically on their physical activity habits, as well as whether they smoked and all sorts of other things, and then followed them until they died. And what he found was, you can see this graph, this is physical activity in calories per week against the all-cause death rate. And if you were under 50, if you exercised about 2,000 calories a week, which is, moderate but not crazy amount of exercise, your death rate was about 21% lower. By the time you got into your 70s and 80s, people who exercised that much had 51% lower death rates, right? So and there's plenty of other studies which show this. So why is that the case? So to make my hypothesis, I'm going to basically do a kind of a review paper and then add some data at the end. So I want to talk first about the evolutionary context of this phenomenon. Then I want to talk about activity and aging, activity and senescence. And then I'm going to, at the end, as a kind of a test case, we'll show you some data that we've collected with my colleagues on hypertensive heart disease. So let's begin with the evolutionary context, right? And this is well known to everybody probably at this talk, which is this ancient puzzle that has long interested primatologists and anthropologists and biologists, which is the differences between human life history and that of apes or monkeys, and which is that we have this not only a longer period of ontogeny prior to maturity, but we also have these several decades of post-reproductive life compared to even chimpanzees or other kinds of primates, including monkeys. So what's going on? Why do we have this long post-reproductive period, which is almost unique in the animal world? I guess orcas are the only other animals that are for which there's good data on this. And now the reason it's a particularly interesting puzzle is because of the selective shadow, right? Here's Peter Medawar, who pointed out that basically once you stop reproducing, natural selection doesn't really care about you, right? And so there's there's an important difference between aging, which is just getting older, which all of us do, whether we like it or not, and senescence, which is deterioration associated with age. And so during the selective shadow, there's really no selection to prevent senescence. And clearly in humans, there's been a shift in that selective shadow, right? And that it's been moved to the right here. And so there's, the first question is, how delayed is the human selective shadow? So if you look at average lifespan of chimpanzees in the wild, again, yeah, speaking to experts who know far more about this than I do, but according to the literature, it's 33. Maximum lifespan in captivity, both in the wild and captivity, seems to be a bit debated, but it looks like, when I look in the literature, I find ranges between about 44 and 66. So, whereas human hunter-gatherers, if they survive childhood, according to that wonderful paper by Mike Girvin and Hilly Kaplan, the modal age of death of hunter-gatherers is between 68 and 78, depending upon which population you're looking at. So we're looking at about at least 10, but probably in most cases a 20-year difference. And the standard stories out there are all basically about intergenerational transfers, right? So there's the grandmother hypothesis that grandmothers go out and are selected because they're foraging for their grandchildren and their children. There's the embodied capital hypothesis, the pooled energy budget hypothesis. I don't really want to go into detail in this talk about the differences, but the key point about all these hypotheses is that there's been selection for humans to live longer than our ape cousins because of the benefits that non-reproductive humans provide to their reproductive sex in terms of not just food, but also other forms of knowledge and information that ultimately leads to improved reproductive success. So an interesting question about that is, has there been selection for increased lifespan? And of course, there's been a lot of research on this, enormous amount of research on this, because everybody wants to find some gene that determines, the human lifespan. And it turns out that if you look at genetic, heritability estimates, lifespan prior to 80 has a pretty small narrow sense heritability. Estimates vary from study to study, but they're all less than 20%. And as we all know, narrow sense heritability estimates are generally overestimates. So there is obviously there must be some genetic basis for extended longevity in humans, but it's not a huge, it doesn't explain a huge amount of the variance. Interestingly enough, though, if you make it to 80, the heritability for extended lifespans goes up. Again, different studies, of course, based on populations, et cetera, come up with different estimates, but they're generally over 20%. I've yet to find any estimates of heritability in non-Western environments. And of course, so far, nobody has yet found any derived genes that confer longer lifespan in humans. There are some SNPs that have been associated, but nobody knows what they do. At least that's my understanding. And so clearly, the vast majority of information or of the determinants of health, including lifespan, is going to be non-genetic. And so this is a very famous study that's been updated many, many times from the New England Journal of Medicine, which showed that the genetic predisposition towards premature death is between 20 to 30%. I think most modern studies put that down now to about 20%, but there's variation from study to study. Social circumstances, such as stress, for example, explain about 30%, pollution, toxins, about 5%, and behavioral patterns like smoking and eating junk food and of course, physical activity explain about 40, 50%. And importantly, access to healthcare explains only about 10% of the variance. So we spent a lot of money getting very little benefit out of it. But today, of course, what I want to focus on is physical activity as part of this behavioral pattern, which of course is not uncorrelated with social circumstances. And the evidence is compelling. I mean, there's so much data. This is just one study. It's an important study because it's based on well more than 1 million adults, which shows the relative risk of death that's age adjusted against minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this is not just exercise. Remember, exercise is discretionary, voluntary physical activity for health and fitness. Physical activity is just moving, right? So this is physical activity, not exercise. And then what it shows is that if you just have about 60 minutes of physical activity a week, you can actually lower your relative risk of death at a given age by about 40%. 150 minutes, which is the WHO, kind of American Heart Association, every major health organization suggests that this should be a normal human minimum. That's about a 50% reduction. As you can see, as you get to higher amounts of physical activity, the curve flattens out. There's, of course, a big debate about whether or not you can over-exercise, but that's not our issue right now. And an important distinction is that when we're thinking about the effects of physical activity on health, we shouldn't think just about lifespan, which is what that former graph showed you. We also need to think about health span, because after all, health span, you might argue, is actually a stronger target of selection. If you're very disabled, you're not going to be actually all that, especially towards the end of life, you're not going to be all that useful in terms of providing food or energy or input to your offspring, and so there's going to be less selection for you. So the evidence is that there was a decrease in both health span as well as lifespan after the origins of agriculture. But today we've increased both health span, we've increased lifespan, but actually there's been somewhat of a decrease in health span because people spend more and more time towards the end of life dealing with chronic diseases like diabetes and osteoporosis and arthritis and heart disease, and the list is very, very, very long. There's plenty of data on this, and can go into all of this later on. So I'd like to propose what I call, kind of jokingly or half jokingly, the active grandparent hypothesis, because I'd like to propose that humans evolved extended health spans and therefore extended lifespans, because after all, lifespan is a function to a large extent of health span, especially if you don't have medical care, not just to be physically active, but also because of physical activity. In other words, healthy longevity is both a cause as well as an effect of physical activity, right? So I think we should not dissociate these things. They're actually causally related. And so fairly well established. I don't think that's too controversial. Obviously, there's a lot of variation from person to person and from ape to ape, but I think that's a reasonable starting point. So the second hypothesis is that humans evolved to remain physically active as they age. So there's, of course, no simple way to measure this, but this is data from Richard Wrangham and Herman Ponzer when Herman was a grad student. And this is a walking distance per day of chimps. Of course, it's not a total measure of physical activity, but it's walking. This is the average number of steps that Westerners take. This is actually based on a worldwide sample of people all around the globe, based on cell phones. So they basically step counts based on cell phones. Interesting differences between populations, and you can see that that sort of average Western humans walk a little bit more than chimpanzees. Again, this is your average. There's a lot of variation. And finally, this is a travel distance per day of the Hadza from data that comes from Ponzer and Raiklin and all those folks. As you can see, they're walking a lot more. I think men average about 15 kilometers a day. Women average about 10 kilometers a day. And there's a bit of a tail off as people get older, but they're still walking a fair amount. Another way of looking at this is to use accelerometers or heart rate monitors and look at moderate and vigorous physical activity per day. There are no, to my knowledge, I've never found any data on apes from the wild using this kind of data, so we have to leave them out. But if you compare but there are data samples for large numbers of Americans for whom they put monitor sensors on them. And recently, Dave Reichland and Herman Ponzer and their students have been doing this for hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And there's also data from the Chimani, and you can see that Westerners are substantially less physically active than hunter-gatherers, who remain pretty physically active throughout their life. There is a decline, but there's even towards when they get to their 60s, 70s, 80s, they're still engaging in way more physical activity than Americans. So even if they're doing like 200 minutes per day, the average American male and female by the time they're in their 70s is engaging in about 12 minutes per day. So it's an order of magnitude more physical activity. Finally, we can look at foraging time per day, because of course people in today, we retire and we become less active. Data from Kristen Hawkes, for example, was just looking at foraging time per day in young Hadza, in mothers, and in grandparents, and she shows that in general the grandparents are actually spending more time foraging per day than the mothers, because they're unencumbered by kids and they're providing a resource for their offspring. And these are famous graphs from the famous Kaplan et al. Paper in Evolutionary Anthropology, which has been cited, I think, several thousand times now, for good reason. It's a really important and brilliant paper. And as Kaplan et al. Show from this the summary of, so here are what chimps produce and consume. Here are what hunter-gatherers consume and produce, mothers and males and females. As you can see that females have an energy deficit up until their 40s or 50s, and then grandparents produce a surplus, grandmothers produce a surplus, and males also produce a surplus. And of course, it's that surplus which makes up for that deficit and helps drive the unique human evolutionary strategy. And of course, so this involves not just younger, but also importantly, older males as well as older females, hence the grandmother hypothesis. Okay, so I think we can establish that humans, compared to other primates, not only selected to live longer, but also that physical activity in older age is really important. And so finally, probably the most important of these hypotheses is that there was selection in humans for physical activity to promote health span, hence also lifespan. And I think there are two sort of important mechanisms. And both involve trade-offs. And one is sort of energetic trade-offs, and the other involves sort of trade-offs that involve repair and maintenance. So, and all this is described in more detail in my book, but let's think about three trade-offs, right? Because you can spend energy on essentially 5 things, right? You can spend it growing your body, which of course you stop doing at some point. You can spend it on maintenance, which you have to do to some extent to keep your body going. You can spend it on storage, of course you get that energy back, so it's a two-way arrow. You can spend it on reproduction, which of course is what selection cares most about. And finally, you can spend it on physical activity. So any energy you don't spend on physical activity, not to mention growth and maintenance, you can ultimately plow into reproduction. And so that's a very important trade-off. So let's talk about these 3 trade-offs towards reproduction, storage, and maintenance in their relationship to physical activity. So the first trade-off is that physical activity diverts energy from reproduction, and that makes sense, right? If I go for a 5-mile run this morning, I'll spend about 500 calories, and that's energy that I cannot spend on something else, and that it could include reproduction. And there's been lots of evidence that there's a complex trade-offs between physical activity and energy devoted towards reproduction that also have complex effects on health. And this is data from Western individuals, but as individuals have up to 2 offspring, there's not necessarily a cost towards longevity, but there is after 2 offspring. And of course, these are not in energy-limited individuals. From non-Western societies, that graph, of course, look different. So there's many studies which show this and how this trade-off works. But it's been shown by Peter Ellison and Gillian Bentley and Garajna Jazinska and all kinds of other folks that there's an important relationship between ovarian function and energy balance and energy flux. And this is one of the first of many studies which have shown this. I just put this up because it was when I was a student, and I remember when this paper came out. But this is women here in Boston and Cambridge, and Ellison and Lager showed that women who jog just 20 kilometers a week, which is not a very large, amount by runner standards, right? It's just kind of reasonable jogging. These are women who are not dieting, they were, whatever, still had about 50% lower progesterone levels prior to menstruation. So that's a good, and there's also now data which shows the same true for estradiol. And I would argue that since 20 kilometers a week is basically averages out to 180 calories a day, it's actually much less than hunter-gatherers typically spend. And so that this kind of physical activity is a much more evolutionary normal level of physical activity, whereas being sedentary is clearly an abnormal level of physical activity. And so that you can make the argument that this elevated level of progesterone as well as estradiol is an abnormal mismatch. And it's been well shown that physical inactivity therefore increases reproductive investment, which makes sense because if you don't have to spend energy on physical activity, natural selection is going to select, favor if you plow that energy towards reproduction. That leads to higher levels of hormones, which can lead to potential mismatches in terms of higher risk of reproductive tissue cancers. And it's been shown, for example, that, if you look at met hours is just a metabolic equivalent is basically, your met of 1 is basically is sitting. So basically how much more physically active you are than sitting is what this parameter measures here on the x-axis. But as you can see, as you get up to higher levels of physical activity, and these are not extreme levels of physical activity, against the odd ratio of getting breast cancer with tumors that are estrogen or progesterone sensitive, that 25 med hours per week, which is not a huge amount of physical activity, lowers your odds ratio of getting breast cancer by about 55%. And of course, breast cancers tend to occur in post-reproductive women for the most part. Okay, so that's the first trade-off. The second trade-off is that physical inactivity diverts surplus energy to fat storage, right? And there's actually been a lot of press about this because there's compelling evidence from around the planet that people have been gaining weight during COVID. Of course, it's not just because of physical inactivity, but many of us have become less physically active. I know that from I've just been analyzing data from my cell phone, but my average step count, not counting my going out for runs, has declined by more than 50% because of the pandemic. And so when we have less energy, spend less energy on physical activity, we can of course plow that energy into storing fat. And of course, there's well-known trade-offs because there are benefits to storing fat, but there are also costs. Here's an example of just one study. Again, there's tons and tons of studies, but this study is particularly interesting. It was done by Bente Peterson and group and colleagues in Copenhagen. But she got 10, normally physically active men who average about 10,000 steps a day. So that's about 5 miles a day, and restricted them for 2 weeks to 1,500 steps a day, which is really, really tough. That's slightly below the US average, right? And they MRI'd them before and after, and you can see that in just those 2 weeks, they added there was a 7% increase in abdominal or visceral fat. There was also increase in all kinds of metabolic consequences of that fat, including higher levels of plasma triglycerides, and they became insulin resistant, and basically their health suffered in all kinds of ways. And so there's an important interaction between physical inactivity and inflammation, because as you gain visceral fat, especially, but fat anywhere, but visceral fat, as those adipocytes store more fat, they become swollen, they become dysfunctional, they attract macrophages, which start producing cytokines that produce inflammation. So that stimulates inflammation, which has all kinds of corrosive effects on health. But also, importantly, muscles are the major anti-inflammatory producing organ in the body. You have a lot more muscle than you have white blood cells. And it turns out that when you exercise, muscles produce anti-inflammatory molecules called myokines, which actually up by about 100-fold more sometimes than white blood cells, and those play an extremely important role in suppressing inflammation. That's one of the reasons why physical activity is so importantly anti-inflammatory. And inflammation has been associated with an astonishing array of diseases, from Alzheimer's and atherosclerosis and type 2 diabetes and hypertension and many cancers and inflammatory bowel disease and arthritis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this really matters, right? So this interaction gives you kind of essentially what we call a double whammy. Now, there's a lot of controversy, however, about physical inactivity and fat storage, because it's quite true that if you want to lose weight, the best way to do that is through diet, right? If you walk a mile, you spend about 50 calories extra. But if you have a plate of chips or fries, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, you're going to ingest 365 calories, right? And the other issue, which is work that Herman Ponzer has been publishing recently, is that there's metabolic compensation. So as people get more active, their metabolic rates can sometimes shift. They can actually go down. But I think we kind of, because of these facts, we sometimes undervalue just how important physical activity is in terms of weight gain. And this is why, right? Because if you just exercise 150 minutes a week, you're going to have very modest weight loss, right? Turns out, so 150 minutes a week turns out to 21 minutes a day, which is, you can lose half a pound a month, and about 6 pounds a year. That is if you don't compensate by eating a lot more food. And that's, pittance for most people who are trying to lose weight. The average American who's trying to lose weight is about trying to lose 50 pounds. So this doesn't do it for most Americans. But again, 150 minutes a week is pretty minimal, right? Remember, hunter-gatherer women are physically active at least just for walking alone. I'm not talking about other activities in camp, for 750 minutes a week, and men for about 1,200 minutes a week. So this is we're really kind of keeping the bar very low. And if you just double that, right, to 300 minutes a week, and there are randomized control studies which have tested this, and that shows that you can lose about a pound a month if you walk about 300 minutes a week. That comes out to about 12 pounds a year. So that's not totally insubstantial. It's not as fast as a serious diet, but it's not insubstantial. And even more importantly, physical activity is extremely important for preventing weight gain and weight regain. There are many studies which show this. This is the one that I particularly enjoy because it's done right here in Boston. But they got a bunch of policemen who were overweight, and they put them on a diet, a very serious diet, serious negative energy balance diet. Some of them dieted, and some of them did diet plus exercise. And the ones who exercised, as you can see, lost a little bit more weight than the dieters. And then when the diet was over, they just monitored them. And the ones who stopped exercising gained their weight back pretty much. There's a little bit of variation. I've sort of simplified the graph a little bit. But the ones who continued to exercise, for the most part, kept the weight off. And again, many, many studies show that. So physical activity is not so important for weight loss, but it really has major benefits in terms of, or major effects in terms of preventing weight gain, or in the case of dieting, weight regain. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, is that physical activity diverts energy towards repair and maintenance. And this has, I think, enormous health implications that are particularly important for aging. And the reason for that is that physical activity is stressful, right? When you go out and go for a run or lift weights or go skiing or whatever it is that you like to do or have to do, right? You're going to be creating little micro cracks in your bone. You're going to be tearing your muscles. You're going to be creating stress in your arteries. There's blood breakdown, hemolysis. There's pressure in your heart, cartilage degradation. There's epithelia damage. That's all the kind of structural damage. And then, of course, there's an enormous amount of cellular and molecular damage. Your mitochondria are pumping out reactive oxygen species, which are highly reactive molecules that will essentially burn tissues all throughout your body and cause DNA damage and lead to protein denaturation in combination with heat, elevated body heat, and you produce all kinds of metabolites that have to be, waste products that have to be removed, and you deplete your phosphagen stores, and you activate your sympathetic nervous system, and you have hypoxia, et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly enough, most of these forms of stress also accrue gradually with aging, right? So it's just that exercise turns up the dial and makes these forms of stress much more acute and much stronger. And I don't have time in this lecture to go into the mechanisms, although my book I do in detail. But the important point is that every single one of these forms of stress elicits repair and maintenance mechanisms from physical activity. As examples, when you're physically active, you create all these reactive oxidative species, but your body pumps out even more antioxidants, which ultimately lower your total level of oxidative stress. You produce inflammation when you exercise, but your body produces even more anti-inflammatory molecules. You create all kinds of enzymes that repair cells and DNA, and you turn on all kinds of growth factors that repair muscle and brain and liver and bone, et cetera, et cetera. The list is incredible and very, very long. And so we can actually kind of see this phenomenon through what's called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, only exercise scientists could come up with a term like this, epic, but basically most people call it their afterburn. And that's basically when you're sitting along, doing really kind of nothing, listening to a lecture like this, you have a certain resting energy expenditure. And then when you exercise, you're going to spend energy exercising, but after you finish exercising, your resting energy expenditure is going to be elevated for as much as 8, sometimes even more hours, sometimes several days. And only about a small percentage of that is actually replacing the energy that you lost. And that epic, right, that afterburn is evidence for repair and maintenance mechanisms doing all kinds of stuff, right? So as you do more physical activity, you're going to invest more energy in repair and maintenance, and you're also going to, and that's probably why there's increased functional capacity as people continue to exercise. And that's not a chump change in terms of the amount of energy, right? So if you calculate, right, so the average, according to Reichland and Company, the average Hadza engages in 135 minutes, excuse me, that should be minutes per day, I apologize, that's a typo, of physical activity. That comes out to about 42 to 98 calories a day, depending upon which model you use, which is about 3 to 5% of resting energy expenditure, which is about, if you add it up, would be enough energy to run between 5 and 14 marathons a year, right? So it's actually a fair amount of energy that's being utilized for repair and maintenance. And so the result is that physical activity counters senescence, right? This is well known. This is not, I haven't made this up, right? This is about as well known as anything is known in science, right? And it decreases our vulnerability to disease. So it's not a magic bullet, but in addition to obesity, physical activity has major effects for preventing heart disease, for preventing respiratory tract infections. It upregulates natural killer and cytotoxic T cells, which is kind of important here in the COVID epidemic, which of course, as we've shown, affects cancer and in more ways than simply just hormones. It has effects on cancer via, for example, sugar and various other sorts of things. It's by far the best way to prevent Alzheimer's and diabetes and arthritis and osteoporosis and depression. The list is very long. And so to finish, I just wanted to quickly talk about some of the research that we've been doing on hypertensive heart disease, because cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in westernized populations. And so my colleagues, Rob Shave and Aaron Bagish and I, and we published this paper recently in PNAS, wanted to look at this. So we wanted to kind of do a comparative study. So Rob has been traveling around the world, collecting data on ape heart health. So we've been doing ultrasounds and collecting all kinds of other data. He's been going to the various chimpanzee sanctuaries, for example. And then Aaron Bagish is a exercise cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and he has an incredible data set on westernized humans. And what I want to focus on today, of course, coronary artery disease is very important, but today I'm just going to talk, because I don't have time to talk about everything, I'm going to talk about hypertensive heart disease, because hypertension is arguably the most serious negative consequence or cause of aging and senescence in the world today in terms of cardiovascular health. This is the prevalence in the United States of hypertension. And you can see that by the time Americans are in their 50s, at least half of Americans are hypertensive. And by the time they hit their 70s, almost 80% of them are hypertensive. And hypertension is problematic because it causes damage to our arteries, it invites atherosclerosis, it has all kinds of negative effects. And one of the effects is on the heart, because it's taught to all medical students that it's normal for people's blood pressure to go up with age, right? But if we look at populations such as, and the first work was done actually in the Kalahari, on hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, and there's been data on the Hadza, et cetera. I'll share some data from the Taromara in a second, but it's been shown that in populations that are very physically active and don't eat processed diets, hypertension doesn't develop. And when you do get hypertension, you get changes, and you use your heart in different ways, you get remodeling of the heart. And what happens is that, in particular, in hypertension, you get what's called concentric remodeling. The heart becomes thicker everywhere, and that's what we call a pressure-adapted heart that decreases wall strain. Whereas people who are very physically active tend to get what's called eccentric remodeling. By the way, I'm talking just about the left ventricle, the major chamber of the heart that pumps body around the blood. That becomes larger and volume adapted, which helps increase cardiac output. You know, how much blood is squeezed for each contraction during systole. So in a normal heart or an enlarged heart, right? That's basically a healthy heart. But when you get a concentric remodeling, first what happens is you get a very thick wall, And for reasons that are not entirely understood, and that's to handle the pressure, because like any other muscle, like my biceps, if you want, biceps has to handle a lot of force, right? You get a thicker biceps. That happens in the heart. But then what happens, for reasons that are not totally understood, the myocytes die in the heart, and then you end up with this dilated heart that's very weak and that's unable to pump blood around the body, and then you get what's called congestive heart failure. So the question we wanted to know is, in absence of lifelong endurance physical activity, a mismatch that increases vulnerability to heart disease. And so we looked at a whole bunch of apes these are apes from sanctuaries. So they're reasonably physically active apes. Obviously, we can't do this in wild populations, which is too bad. Rob has also managed to study a few gorillas. Unfortunately, they're all from zoos. And then we've got a variety of different human beings who differ in terms of how they use their bodies, right? So we've got sedentary Bostonians, we've got sub-elite runners, we've got American football linemen. So these are physically active people who do only resistance physical activity, and they don't do endurance. And then finally, we looked at a population of Taromara subsistence farmers, which is where I've been doing fieldwork for a while. Taromara are very useful because it's a very low disease population, very healthy population, and a lot of people live to old age. And so we collected echocardiograms on all these folks, collected blood pressure. We also did accelerometry on the Taromara. And to make a long story short, chimps become hypertensive very quickly. By about 16 to 18 years, most chimps are, by human standards, hypertensive. Of course, it's not entirely known what that means. Americans, as I've showed you before, tend to be hypertensive by the age of 50. So NHANES is a huge data set. We're talking about thousands and thousands of Americans. We have well over 100 Taromara, and you can see that they basically remain normotensive throughout their life. This is just another way of looking at the data, just to show it's a little bit cleaner, but you can see that chimps are basically hypertensive, Americans become hypertensive, and the Taromara don't become hypertensive. So it's well known that in humans, hypertension is partly caused by diet, so poor diet, so with a lot of saturated fats, processed foods, stress can elicit hypertension. And of course, it's well known that physical inactivity is a major risk factor for hypertension. We don't really know the case for chimpanzees. Diet, we can rule out diet. Stress might be very important. But also one question is physical inactivity, the lack of aerobic physical activity in chimpanzees. And I already showed you data earlier that chimpanzees don't engage in that much aerobic physical activity. And so the hypothesis is that because of this pressure volume challenge trade-off, which I'll show you in a second, endurance physical activity protects humans from cardiovascular disease through a combination of derived adaptations and phenotypic plasticity, right? And that it's going to affect left ventricle structure and function. So that, again, when you're doing resistance physical activity, when you're lifting weights, you have a pressure challenge, right? When this guy is firing all those muscles, contracting all those muscles, he's got to push blood through those contracted muscles in order to maintain blood pressure so he can perfuse his brain. Otherwise, he'll faint, right? Whereas when somebody's running, like here I am in this silly photo, my goal, I don't have a lot of resistance being generated, but I have to pump higher volumes of blood throughout my body to not only perfuse my brain, but also to supply all those muscles with the energy they need. So what we found is that essentially chimpanzees have extremely pressure adapted hearts. And this is after scaling for size. So this is a chimpanzee here in red. Here are sedentary Bostonians in green. Here are Taromara subsistence farmers in blue. And this is basically the heart's twisting ability during systole. So this is contraction, and diastole, that's filling. And you can see that during systole, there's rotation at the base of the heart, but apical rotation, the top of the end of the heart, is basically flat in chimpanzees. And so what's going on is that chimpanzees essentially don't have this kind of helical torsion that humans have that enable the heart to essentially store elastic energy, which improves cardiac output. So chimpanzees are deficient already in one ability that helps them have high cardiac output. And this is a slide you should never put up, but I couldn't figure out how to turn this into a simple graphic. But my point here is that we've, again, studied all kinds of different human beings, and we looked at cardiac output and wall thickness and various other sorts of stuff. And the bottom line is that no matter who you are as a human being, even the most pressure adapted human beings have much more volume adapted hearts than apes after you scale for size. And by the way, gorillas are even worse. Gorillas are like super pressure adapted hearts, very, very, very little volume capability. And here's the punchline. Here's why it's important. Because there's a functional trade-off. And this trade-off was studied by my colleague, Aaron Bagish. This is something I could never do because I'd be put in jail if I even tried to do it. But what they did is they took a whole bunch of people who varied in terms of whether they were strength versus physical or resistance athletes, measured their hearts, and then gave them both a pressure challenge and a volume challenge. So the volume challenge was basically to give them a liter of saline, right? Just add saline to their blood. Of course, it's done in a hospital. It's hard for the blood, for the heart to pump all that extra volume. And then they measured the stroke volume. And then they also did the same thing with a really hard hand grip, right? So they have to really put a lot of resistance, a lot of pressure, to keep that hand grip. And again, measured stroke volume during this challenge. And what they found is if you plot relative wall thickness, right? So this is how thick the wall that the left ventricle is relative to the overall size of the heart, that the thicker your heart, the less able you are able to handle that stroke volume, right? So thick hearts are basically poorly adapted, poorly able to handle the functional challenge of high cardiac outputs. But the thick hearts were also able to continue to basically maintain the same stroke volume in the face of resistance, whereas the endurance athletes with very thin walled but large chambered hearts really were unable to maintain the same stroke volume as they were doing that resistance challenge. So what this means is that there's a trade-off. If you're good at handling pressure, you're not good at handling volume. And if you're good at handling volume, you're not good at handling pressure. This is a fundamental trade-off. This is like as strong a trade-off as you can find in physiology. And importantly, human beings who don't engage in physical activity, endurance physical activity, end up, their hearts shift through phenotypic plasticity and end up approaching what essentially chimpanzees look like. So this is a kind of a complicated analysis, but basically this is looking at pressure adapted traits versus volume adapted traits. These are chimpanzees here in red. These are various human populations. And you can see that football players, in terms of pressure adaptation, essentially approach chimpanzees. And in terms of volume adaptations, sedentary human beings and football players are actually very much like chimpanzees, right? And so the consequence is that lifelong physical activity, especially endurance physical activity, prevents this kind of vicious cycle that can help contribute to congestive heart failure, right? So if you don't do endurance physical activity, you can generate hypertension through mechanisms I haven't had a chance to discuss, but it has to do with nitrous oxide and whatever. That leads to a pressure adapted left ventricle, which decreases your endurance physical activity capability, which kind of keeps driving this vicious circle. And of course, that's just for hypertensive heart disease. Lifelong physical activity has been shown to have lots of other benefits. It's extremely important for coronary artery disease. Some of you saw the fantastic paper in The Lancet by Hilly Kaplan and Mike Gervin and colleagues showing that the Chamane, for example, who are moderately physically active but eat a pretty high carb diet, basically have no coronary calcifications. It's important for preventing sarcopenia. So this is data of the UK against the ACE. I'm sorry, something wrong with the figure here, but the ACE basically are about 75th percentile for men and about 90th percentile for women. And importantly, as they age, they maintain their grip strength as they age, so they're not having flesh loss. And then before you ask, because I know anybody intelligent should ask this question, what about would it protect apes? And this would be the ideal experiment, right? And I would love to get some feedback from you folks, but the problem is that you could never do an experiment where you could get to, first of all, be unethical, but also if you tried to get an ape to do endurance physical activity for long periods of time, first of all, there would be cardiovascular constraints. Their left ventricles might not be able to handle it very well. But also there were thermoregulatory constraints because they're unable to dump heat as well as humans because of fur and they can't sweat as much. And also their muscle fiber types would make it challenging. So I don't know if you could ever do that, but people have done this in rodents. So for example, you can look at rats and mice. So you can a bunch of studies which look at exercised mice versus sedentary mice and rats. And the interesting thing is that maximum lifespan in exercise rodents is actually not really increased by physical activity, even substantial amounts of physical activity. There are quite a few studies that show this. And in fact, if you look at mammals in general, you might think that animals in the wild, they're more free ranging, they get more physical activity than animals in zoos and in captive populations. And there was this great paper a few years ago by Tidier et al. In Nature Scientific Reports, and they show that for the vast majority of species, rates of senescence and maximum lifespans, of course, obviously extrinsic mortality you have to exclude because, of course, wild population animals will die for all kinds of reasons, but even in animals that don't have a lot of extrinsic mortality, for 85% of mammals in both sexes, animals in zoos have much longer lifespans and slower rates of senescence. So physical inactivity is certainly not hurting them. So humans might be special. All this to say that, to go back to our three hypotheses, I think we can show that humans evolved to be more physically active than apes. I think we can also show that humans evolved to remain physically active as we age. And then finally, I think there's compelling evidence, although we need more data, that there's been selection for physical activity to promote health span, hence lifespan. And of course, there's a lot of variation in terms of phenotype. It's not a one size fits all. And so there's a lot more research to do, but I think the implications are unquestionable, right? We should promote more physical activity, not just for everybody at every age, but especially in older individuals. Just to remind you, older Americans are engaging in half the amount of already pathetically low physical activity of young Americans. And that's causing a wide range of health problems. And so to conclude, I think more of us need to be like one of the great heroes, I think, of the last few decades, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who stayed strong and vigorous by being physically active throughout her life. Okay, so thank you very much. And I think it's time to stop and take some questions.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful talk. Very thought-provoking, and I expect everybody to run out immediately and get some exercise. So, but I do hope we can all hold ourselves in place just for a little while so that we can continue the conversation. But very, very good. We have many questions that have come in through the YouTube channel, and I think I will just be able to ask a few here.
I got all the time in the world, but you go ahead. Okay.
And these are questions that fall into different areas of what you've discussed here. But here, what about senescence? First question is, what impact does information transfer have on the evolution of older age? One advantage of having older individuals in the group is how much they collect. It's not how much they collect, but their knowledge of the environment. So that would be something that we'd like some comments on.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I wasn't arguing that the only benefit of physical of aging is being physically active. That's one of the reasons I really like the embodied capital hypothesis. It's kind of a very kind of comprehensive view of the various other adaptive benefits of older individuals and the wisdom and the information they provide. So I completely agree. But of course, if you're in a non-Western society with no access to healthcare and you're in old age and you have a high level of morbidity, your ability to transfer that information might also be compromised. I don't know anybody has studied that, but if you're very ill and suffering, because we know that basically people die faster in such populations. So I think that's why I would argue that selection is really probably stronger on health span than on lifespan. But it's kind of harder to measure health span. So we tend not to measure it that much. But of course, I totally agree about information transfer, 100%.
Very good. And you did mention the genetics briefly in the talk. And here is a question about the active grandparent hypothesis that suggests that longevity was not only selected for, but also made possible by having to work moderately during old age. Is there any genetic evidence for this sort of selection?
Not a lot. There's some folks who've been trying to look at the selection for behavioral traits that make people more likely to exercise. But the problem is that those are Westerners who have to choose to exercise, right? I mean, exercise is so weird, right? Today we live in the world where we no longer have to do anything, right? We have shopping carts and cars and, electric toothbrushes, everything, right? So, are the genetic basis for people who are, want to go out and run 5 miles a day or go to the gym or whatever, anything at all relevant to the selection that happened in hunter-gatherer populations when people had to go out and forage, right? So there's no data on any of that, none, zilch, in terms of behavioral genes that's relevant to an evolutionary hypothesis. People have studied mice. They've got mice strains. So there are mice who are more likely to run on treadmills, little wheels than others. Whether that's relevant to humans, I have no idea. I'm not saying that there's no genetic basis. Of course, every aspect of phenotype is a gene-environment interaction. But it's just so far the evidence for genetic important genes hasn't been very useful, and it's not very strong. But of course, I'm not an anti-geneticist, that's for sure.
Good, and we do have a question about the fossil record, and how far back in our evolution would you say that this pattern that you've described for us, for modern humans, how far back did it emerge, and can we really tell from the fossils or any other aspects of our behavior when this pattern would have emerged
That's a great question. So I would argue that you can't really have the hunting and gathering system to work, right, without a fair amount of endurance physical activity, right? So I think once you go, by the time you get stone tools and some kind of meat eating, whether it was scavenging or hunting or whatever, you need to have, cooperation. You need to have division of labor. You need to have, we have expansion of body size with Homo erectus. I mean, I think all of that points to the origins of this system. Of course, whether it was, like what we see today is impossible to tell and probably improbable. So I would say that, there's a compelling argument to be made that once hominins became hunter-gatherers, sometime around the origins of the genus Homo, and it's going to be a messy transition, I don't see how you can make that system work. Brain expansion and all the other evidence for increased energy budgets, but it's going to be challenging to test that exactly. In terms of longevity, the fossil record is pretty silent on that, and it's very hard to interpret the data. If you believe the demographic evidence from, say, Atapuerca, et cetera, it's really not until the Upper Paleolithic that we have, good evidence for human longevity of the kind that we see today. But absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and I think everybody who studies this has lots of question marks about that. It's really just hard to tell.
Mm-hmm. And again, from a comparative perspective, you've talked a lot about chimpanzees and humans and lifespan. There are field studies of chimpanzees now that, after people have been in the field studying chimpanzees for 50 years or so, that now are showing that the lifespan of chimpanzees can reach 50 or 60 years, and that our understanding of their lifespan may be partly due to study biases. So if chimpanzees are indeed living longer in the field in nature than we knew until now, does that make any difference in some of the hypotheses that you've been talking about?
Well, first of all, many people in this audience know way more about this than I do, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. My understanding is that comes from the site of Ngogo. And I'm not sure if there are any other chimp sites that have found that kind of extended lifespan. And my understanding that in Ngogo, they have very, very low extrinsic mortality from predators. But even then, 50 is not 58, 68 to 78. So I think there's still a substantial and important difference between what we see in terms of maximum lifespan of chimpanzees, even at places like Ngogo, compared to what we observe in foraging populations. Because remember, according to Gervin and company, the modal age of death of hunter-gatherers in various populations, I can't remember how many populations are in that spectacular 2007 paper that they published, but it's between 68 and 78. All right, that's substantially longer, than what we see even in long-lived chimpanzees. And I think the question you have to ask is, whether the environment in Ngogo, because it's predator-free, is really typical of what chimpanzees experience for most of their evolutionary history. But that's not my expertise, and I would love to hear more of what people who study apes think.
Very good, and we may be able to hear some more about this. Now, staying with chimpanzees, another question about estimating the degree of physical activity. You've shown some of the data from chimpanzees, but if we include something like climbing trees, is this one of the elements that we measure when considering their activity patterns and the energy that they expend?
So yeah, so I did look at that, and actually there is data from Herman Ponzer and a few others who've looked at this. And chimps do climb trees, but they don't climb trees that much. and they don't spend that much energy doing it. So it's not a huge effect. But there's a nice paper from 2006 by Ponzer and Wrangham, which looks at the energetic expenditure of tree climbing, and it's all from Kabali. I don't know if anybody's done a similar energetic study on any other site, but it's not a substantial amount. Yes, climbing a tree does spend some energy, but it's not a crazy amount of energy, and it's not. I don't think it would change the estimates. I mean, I think, and furthermore, when you look at doubly labeled water data, which is what people have been doing, that includes everything they're doing, right? From sneezing to copulating to climbing trees to walking, etc. Their energy expenditure levels are low, no matter how you measure it. Of course, there's going to be a lot of variation from day to day. I mean, I remember Richard Wrangham telling me about one day when he saw some male chimpanzees go on a patrol. I think he said they did 10 kilometers, which is the longest he'd ever seen them go. And he said that they were just knocked out the next day. It's like they just sat inert for the next 24 hours, barely able to move. I mean, this is anecdotal evidence from Richard. I've never seen this, but so obviously there's variation, but it's not average for them. Whereas 10 kilometers a day is that's like totally average for a hunter-gatherer female, and men do even more.
Very interesting. I'm sure the anecdotal evidence from Wrangham is completely reliable, so we'll take it.
Absolutely, I would never contradict Richard on everything.
Very good. Another question on the comparative framework. Besides humans, are there any other animals that are adapted to this sort of endurance physical activity? And if they are there ways in which they're essentially similar or very different from human endurance activity?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, there are other endurance adapted animals, but there's no other animal that we know of that's adapted for both endurance and longevity. Because of this unique human life history pattern. And that's, I think, what's unique about humans, this combination of post-reproductive lifespan / health span plus endurance physical activity that I think is this kind of magic mix, right? And it's why humans, I think it's one of the reasons why humans get into trouble if we become sedentary as we age, right? It's a mismatch. And that's, not true for, my dog, is endurance adapted. But she spends most of the day doing nothing, right? She just kind of sits around the house all day. She loves to go for short, for runs, etc. But and there's no evidence that dogs who are physically active actually live longer. So it's not a very well tested hypothesis, because you can imagine that the experiments are not so pleasant. It's been done in mice and rats and things like that, but it's, obviously there's not a lot of strong lifelong experimental evidence for longer lived animals for obvious reasons. It's hard to do that. So you have to rely more on retrospective or comparative data.
So several of our colleagues here in the lab, of course, are studying primates in the wild. So we have another question about primates, and this is with the new technologies that are emerging now to study behavior, movements in the wild, and so on. Would you say that there are critical studies that can be carried out in the wild with apes and perhaps other primates that would provide data that are critically missing at this time?
I love that question, because I've been thinking about it a lot and talking to colleagues here. I think for me the dream data would be if we could get heart rate monitor data on wild animals, and I don't see that being easy to do, because you'd have to tranquilize an animal, put a heart rate monitor on it, etc. That would not be easy, or maybe even ethical to do. So that would be my dream data. But even if we could get somehow get sensors on animals and just get accelerometry data or something, just get better physical activity from wild animals. So there's Meg Crowfoot has been doing pretty cool stuff in Cayo Santiago. She's been using the satellite system there. Obviously, those are all radio tagged, so tagged animals. So there's new technologies that are capable of doing some of this. None of them are going to be easy to do on wild populations. I mean, you folks know this way better than me. I've had the chance to observe apes in the wild, but not to study them. And I can, but yes, it would be super exciting to get better data, because it's, we're really, the quality of data we have for wild animals versus humans is order of magnitudes different.
Very good. And we do have a few questions about exercise and physical activity. Let me start with one here. Does the form of physical activity affect the trade-offs that you discussed? So for example, cardio versus cardio or long distance running versus high intensity workouts or weight training. So does the form of the physical activity affect the trade-offs?
Sure. I mean, each kind of different physical activity results in different kinds of trade-offs. So some of the trade-offs are just purely energetic, right? So it depends on how much energy you're spending. So if it's an energy trade-off, then, you know, for the most part, cardio spends more energy than resistance, right? So you can imagine that. But it's going to be different, say, for, you know, cardiovascular stress, right? So that's going to, you know, as I showed you, resistance versus cardio has very different effects on the heart. The same would be true for muscle hypertrophy, for bone response. So yeah, there's each different kind of physical activity is going to result in different stresses and hence in different energetic costs, hence different trade-offs. And so, you know, it depends on whether you want to look at a broad brush kind of a perspective versus kind of narrow down on particular kinds of senescence. So it's a hard question to ask. It's a good question. It would take a long time to answer it comprehensively. So for example, for dementia, example, which I think is another interesting trade-off, the evidence seems to be that, you know, first of all, by far the best way to prevent Alzheimer's is physical activity. It can lower incidence rates by at least 30% by most estimates, which is far better than any other known intervention. But it looks like more vigorous physical activity has much bigger benefits than more sort of moderate physical activity, based on just some studies. And the studies again are limited. So every system is going to be different.
And along those lines, Dan, another question here is, there's a difference in the type of stamina between, let's say, sprinters and long distance runners. So for example, wide receivers, the question goes, can do many sprints in a game, but do poorly in a marathon. Is this difference reflected in the heart or some other aspects of physiology?
God, well, first of all, I think it's very important to distinguish between elite athletes and performance, the way we think about it, and what natural selection probably cared about. So yes, if you're trying to run a marathon as fast as you can, versus sprint as fast as you can, those trade-offs are marked, right? Let's take the world's best marathon runner, Eliud Kipchoge, right? He can run like a 440 mile for 26.2 miles, right? That's like 6 meters a second approximately. Whereas Usain Bolt, the world's fastest sprinter, can run 10.4 meters a second, but he can't do it for more than like 20 seconds, right? And if Usain Bolt ran a marathon at his sprinting speed, he'd run a marathon in 1:07, which would be pretty spectacular, right? Whereas if Kipchoge ran 100 meters at his fastest speed, he'd do like a 16:57 or something, which would not, I mean, you know, that would be pathetic, right? So at the elite level, there's this big trade-off. But for most of us, that trade-off actually turns out not to exist. And actually, if you look in evidence from animals from across many different species, that trade-off is not so important. It turns out that animals that are good at power and speed are also better at endurance. Look at soccer players; they're good at both. And you know, when people hunted and ran in the old days to hunt, you know, when we have data on running speeds for hunters, you know, they're doing 10-minute miles. They're running really slowly. They're not pushing it, right? And that's like a 4-hour marathon, right? And that's you know, that's half the speed of an elite marathoner, right? So, and that's sufficient for long distance sort of persistence hunting. So I think that, you know, when we look at elite performance, we're looking at a kind of a biased perspective that doesn't really have a lot to do with selection. So from an evolutionary perspective. So yes, at the elite levels, these trade-offs are there aplenty. But for the rest of us, and for what natural selection probably cares about, those trade-offs I think are minimal. And in fact, the evidence is if you really want to improve your endurance, one of the best ways to do that is to do high intensity interval training. You know, do it a few times a week. That actually not only improves your speed, it also improves your endurance. So so that trade-off doesn't exist at that level either.
Mm-hmm. And along the line of what might be best for us also, should we specifically be promoting more endurance activity rather than necessarily resistance activity is the question. Something like weightlifting and that sort of thing.
Yeah, this is a common question. So there's a big debate about weightlifting and resistance training. And I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I think that the consensus would be among my colleagues who are doctors, so I'm quoting them, not me, is that there's pretty compelling evidence that the absence of any endurance physical activity is a problem, right? So if you do resistance training, doing cardio is not your enemy, right? So there are people who only like to lift weights and they don't like to do any cardio, and that's not optimal. I think there's plenty of evidence. There's a famous study in Finland, for example, which looked at, because of course Finland has nationalized healthcare, and they were able to look at basically everybody in Finland, and they compared Olympic athletes who were resistance athletes, strength athletes versus endurance athletes versus the rest of the Finnish population, and they looked at heart disease as the outcome, and they found that the endurance athletes did much better than the population as a whole in terms of cardiovascular outcome and how much time they spent in hospitals, etc. The strength athletes, the wrestlers, the weightlifters, they actually were the same or worse than the average Finnish population. So they weren't getting that benefit in terms of heart disease. So I think it's not strength training is important for aging, right? It prevents sarcopenia, and which prevents frailty and loss of function and capability, and so that's important. So I think that almost everybody agrees. Mix it up, right? If you really care about doing exercise for the sake of your health, cardio is the bedrock of most prescriptions. But some strength training is important, and the older you get, the more it is important. And if you want to even do better, do a little high intensity interval training, which is a form of cardio. It's not resistance training, and that also has some benefits. But be careful though. If you're unfit, you should probably see a doctor or something like that before you do it. So I think that's. But probably everybody already knew that. Hippocrates probably knew that. Galen probably knew that a few thousand years ago.
Good. May I ask one last question that we have here? It's a bit longer, but evolutionary developmental approaches, it goes, postulate that exposure to harsh and unpredictable environments calibrate development, creating stress-adapted individuals with altered ontogenetic trajectories. And this refers to Ellis et al. And has increasingly been applied to explain inter-individual differences in energy allocation within species. Would you expect harsh and unpredictable environments to affect physical exercise relative to people not exposed to these stressors and environments?
That's a fascinating question. We actually addressed that in a recent paper on arthritis. So we looked at Taromara from different environments, and found that, because we thought these people are so physically active, they're going to have lower rates of arthritis, but it turns out that they didn't. But what we found was a strong association between visceral adiposity and leg length and incidence of arthritis. So they're energy challenged probably in utero and maybe early in life. They had shorter leg lengths, which is a pretty good marker of energy, negative energy, stress in growing up. And those individuals now in this modern environment with a lot of energy were more prone to gaining visceral fat, which of course has effects on inflammation, and arthritis is intrinsically an inflammatory disease, and so it's very closely related to obesity. So I suspect there are a lot of these early life developmental influences on the interactions between physical activity and phenotype that affect chronic disease later in life, and it's an important topic to do research on. So I love the question. It's a great question and absolutely worth studying.
Very good, Dan. Fascinating talk and topics. And again, I expect that we're all going to run out from our confinement now and get some exercise regardless of the weather. We had snow here in Oxford. And also I'm going to promote your book.
Oh, thank you.
So for those of us who want to get more deeply into some of these topics, Dan fortunately is done quite a bit of writing and thinking about this, so I would recommend getting a hold of his latest book, some of the earlier ones too. So thank you, Dan, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. It's been very good to see you, very good to hear this. I wanted to thank our audience too, and remind you that we have another talk next week. Susan Chaney. At the regular schedule is 4 p.m. Oxford time. So just to remind you of that. And again, thank you so much to our audience, and thank you so much to you, Dan, for this really wonderful, brilliant talk and conversation.
My pleasure. I had a great fun.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Everybody be well. Stay safe.
Stay well.
That's
Stay
cliche,
safe.
but cliches are usually cliches because they're true.
And
it's kind of scary out there right now.
Very good.
Don't end the YouTube. Don't end the